Charlie Kirk is dead after an unspeakable act of violence, and his death has dominated the American news cycle for the past week. I know that there have been great responses, great think pieces, and there's a conversation to be had about Charlie Kirk's life and death. That is not the conversation I will be having today. I want to talk about the response to his death, especially from right-wing leadership in this country. I would call the response from his family, his friends, and the organization that he founded the conservative grift. It is a cycle of conservative grift. Hi, I'm Liz. Welcome to my channel. I talk about whatever's on my mind, so hop on board. The reaction to Charlie Kirk's death has three kind of movements, and at least what I'm seeing in the mainstream media and on my social media. So I thought we'd dive into them and the impact of these three reactions on American culture. Now, he has been dead a very, very, very short time. So there could be more reaction and I could be having big, massive blind spots. But I sat down and I wrote the script in like 30 minutes because this is how much I'm seeing of these three movements, and I just gotta talk it out and see what y'all think. The first reaction, the leaving the left grift. And I'm guilty of this. I posted why I left the Republican Party, and I know there's a whole, and some people called me a grifter for sharing that. I understand there's a whole industry of making money talking about why the political movement you were once affiliated with is no longer your line of interest. But the post-Charlie Kirk apocalypse of leaving the left content is truly grifting. I do think there is a difference between sharing your thoughts and earning money off of it and using a man's death to blame an entire political movement and to then push for people to abandon their political convictions by casting them as evil because a man was killed. I think if you are watching what happened to Charlie Kirk and you are blaming the left and saying, I left the left, what an odd phrase, I left the left because Charlie Kirk was killed, then you were never really a part of the left to begin with, because no one in political leadership on the left is calling for the execution of people we disagree with. I just don't see Nancy Pelosi saying that. I don't see Hakeem Jeffries or Beto O'Rourke or anyone who has been a face of the Democratic Party for the last decade endorsing or calling for the execution of people we disagree with. I also think it's highly irresponsible to blame left-leaning politicians for political violence in this country when we know that right-wing political violence exists and has been fomented by conservative talking points. The biggest case of this is probably the El Paso shooting, where a shooter was motivated by anti-immigrant rhetoric to drive to a Walmart that was heavily frequented by Latino people and commit an unspeakable act of violence that left 22 people dead. The libertarian-leaning Cato Institute studied political violence in the country and who is motivated by which political side, and they did report a higher rate of right-wing motivated attacks in the last decade. I'm not going to sit here and say that no one has ever committed violence who has not been inspired by leftist policies, or leftist rhetoric, I should say. But I'm not also going to sit here and say it's all one party's fault. I think we have to be honest about what side actively condemns political violence and what side actively silently encourages it by not condemning it. After Charlie Kirk's death, both left democratically elected people and Republican elected people have come out and been very outspoken against what happened. That is simply not the case when right-wing motivated violence happens in this country. And unlike the right, I and many other Democratic and left and liberal leaning people do not blame an entire movement for the actions of one terrible person, of one evil person, I should say. I disagree. I abhor the Trump administration and their policies, but I don't think their strict immigration policies led to the El Paso shooting. I do think a lot of their rhetoric could have, but I don't think necessarily that conservative politics, conservative policies lead to violence. Otherwise, if conservative immigration policies led to violence, we would see anti-immigrant violence in places like Japan and Denmark that have much stricter anti-immigrant laws than the US. And I think there's a difference between passing conservative laws and creating xenophobia with your legal law positions. I don't blame right-leaning policies for terrorism. I think rhetoric matters, and leadership excusing or burying their heads in the sand and ignoring the terrible actions of the people who've espoused their politics leads to further violence. I think if a person commits an act of terror and quotes you, and you ignore the fact that they've quoted you, you are silently encouraging more acts of terror. If you're a former liberal and you are saying, I'm leaving the left because of Charlie Kirk's murder, I highly doubt you have ever been on the left or cared about liberal politics like affordable housing and education and universal health care and reproductive rights and equality. Because if you actually cared about those things, you would understand that acts of violence and terrorism do not help us have a more equitable or good society, and you would not only denounce that, but you wouldn't join a party that is actively pushing economic policies that punish the lower class, reward billionaires, and extract resources from the working class to further enhance the lives of the wealthy. Because we can talk about that as an act of violence in and of itself, but that's for another video. I think it's a grift to be like, I left the left because of Charlie Kirk's death, or you should leave the left. I'm never voting Democrat again because of Charlie Kirk's death. We don't know the motive of the person who did this crime, or who is accused of doing this crime, I should say. So to ascribe motivation to this person and use this person as a reason to create content about why you left a political party before we even know the motive of this shooter, of the alleged shooter, it just screams grift to me. It is sad when a person dies. Sometimes they need help with covering the cost of the funeral and providing for their future family. But at the time of his death, Charlie Kirk owned 3 different homes. According to reporting from local news outlets in Phoenix, he owned a $4.75 million estate in Phoenix with sweeping desert views. I'm sure it's a beautiful home. He owned a nearby Phoenix apartment. I don't know why he owned an apartment and a home in Phoenix, but he did. And he owned a beachside condominium here in Florida on the Gulf Coast. Not only that, he was paid, as of 2021, this is the latest financial records I could find, he was paid a salary of over $400,000 every year. Turning Point USA, the company he founded, reported a net revenue of $55 million in 2021. They also had an endowment, they still have an endowment, that they reported a revenue of $16 million in 2021. And yet, in less than a week after his death, Turning Point USA has fundraised off of this tragedy to the tune of $6 million from donations to Turning Point and the Kirk family. I'm not opposed to families in need creating a GoFundMe to help cover funeral costs and to cover, their daughter's college education and all of that after a person has died. But Turning Point USA has all of that money in the bank. Charlie Kirk's widow has money. There have been reports that he had a net worth of $14 million with all of his assets. Like, his family does not need donations. And it is not just like that people were like, oh, how can we help? And then donated money. No, Turning Point USA created an email marketing campaign to get money from people to help, to quote, help Charlie Kirk's family and continue the mission of Turning Point USA after his death. Less than 3 days after he died, Erica Kirk posted a video that was posted on almost every social media platform. It was a well-produced, well-narrated marketing video. It was a message following her husband's death where she threatened people who she blames, quote, the left, and says that these evildoers, the left, will be held to account. It's probably one of the scariest videos I've ever seen in my life, genuinely. Like, threatening people who had nothing, like threatening an entire group of people who voted differently from you because a truly evil, awful person did an evil deed, and now you're threatening everybody who voted opposite of you. And she posted this video, and then immediately Turning Point USA sent emails to everybody who's ever signed up for Turning Point asking for donations, including pictures of Erica and Charlie, and using rhetoric that is well known to encourage people to donate money. It is disgusting to me to see a Christian organization use emotionally loaded language like this to just get money off of people, especially at a time when we're in an economic recession and when people are struggling financially. And if the main message of Charlie Kirk's life was to be a Christian, love your neighbor as yourself, which is what Jesus said is the main message of Christianity, then you would think you would want to donate to your neighbors in need, to your community, not to a political organization that has an endowment of over $16 million. But this is not unusual from people in the Kirk Turning Point circle. Every time, I know this because I used to work at TV News, and because of that, I got all the campaign emails from every single campaign. Every time Donald Trump was in the news from 2021 to 2024 when he was reelected, he used every single opportunity to fleece more money from his followers. There was a mugshot of him. Let's drive up sales. Indicted. Let's send another email and ask for dollars. Lose a case in court. That's another push for money. Reporting shows that these emails are effective at getting money from people, and they're especially effective at getting money from our most vulnerable populations, which are elderly dementia patients who in the past have been politically active and still check their email but do not have the mental faculties to understand what they're signing up for. Often, dementia patients become a candidate's top donor because they sign up for recurring donations. Their caregiver might not know, or they might not be in a position where they need a caregiver yet, and they can lose hundreds of thousands of dollars because they don't realize most of these emails will set you up to do a recurring donation unless you know how to opt out of it. This is a quote from some of that reporting. An 80-year-old communications engineer from Texas was a dementia patient who fell prey to deception. In September 2022, the unnamed man donated $250 to Ron Johnson's campaign for Senate. But as he was barraged with messages over the next year and a half, the Lone Star senior, who for years had thrifted his clothes and driven an old car in order to save for retirement, unknowingly made more than 15,000 transactions, amounting to more than $440,000 in donations. It is true, this is not just Republicans who use this tactic. Democrats do this. There was one woman who they interviewed who genuinely thought Nancy Pelosi, when she was getting text from the Nancy Pelosi campaign, she thought that Nancy had her number and was just like, hey girl, send me dollars, and thought that it was like a personal text message from Nancy Pelosi and not an automated campaign text. I think these tactics, I understand they're effective. They bring in dollars. I think they're evil, and they prey on the most vulnerable, and there should be systems in place to protect vulnerable people from these kind of campaign barrage tactics to get money out of people. And Turning Point USA is using the same tactics. The Trump world has perfected these tactics, though, to a whole other level by selling limited edition collector items to people. You have the Trump Bible, the Trump medallions, the Trump crypto. It's all part of a larger scheme to get cheap knockoff products from China, label them as Trump, and then sell them to his most devoted followers and get loads of money out of them. It's an endless grift of squeezing every dime you can out of your voting base. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see Charlie Kirk's death used in this way for a very, very long time, because not only is it emotional to see somebody die publicly, it's as emotional to see a young widow, young children, and people have this emotional connection to the organization that Kirk founded. And Turning Point USA and the Kirk family they already are using his death to grab every penny they can from people, because that $16 million endowment isn't going to get to $17 million without a little bit of help. And then the third front that we will continue to see, and that's going to continue to be a massive problem, I think, for the rest of my life, unfortunately, is the Christian nationalism of it all. Currently, my TikTok algorithm, I cannot escape it, is full of people saying, I showed up to church for the very first time, which is good for you. If church is what you need, great for you. But it's not just church. It's this pairing of patriotism and national trauma and that church and Christianity is the answer. And That's what tends to happen after politically traumatic events, nationally traumatic events. We did see after 9/11 a massive rise in church attendance. It wasn't very long lasting, but it did have deep cultural impacts. Not only did we see an increase in church attendance after 9/11, it was paired with a fomenting of cancellation and hate for anything that was deemed un-American, non-patriotic, or against the cultural grain. Need I say, the Dixie Chicks saying, let's not go to war with Iraq, and then their career was ruined forever. And it wasn't just the Dixie Chicks, there was a massive amount of xenophobia, freedom fries, am I right? And that's not the only time this has happened, but I think 9/11 shows us the worst American response that there can be. You have a pairing of patriotism with xenophobia and hate. Whereas in other times of national crisis, we have patriotism and the better qualities of our human nature. After Pearl Harbor, Americans rose up the national industrial complex of creating the airplanes and the weapons that would defeat fascism came together. We had, the posters, the iconic Betty the Riveter, Rosie, we have the iconic Rosie the Riveter poster, and this national pride that America, we were behind, we were surprised, we weren't ready to go to war, and we came together. We took down both the Nazis and the Japanese imperialists, and that was a huge moment of response to a national tragedy. There were negatives to it. You have Japanese internment camps that happened, but the overall result was good, and that we defeated Japanese imperialism and fascism in Europe. After JFK's death, a very similar moment of shock and horror. His death propelled us to reach for the stars. Literally, the moon landing would not have happened if JFK had not been assassinated, because most people thought NASA was like a giant waste of money. And then the guy who was like, let's go to the moon, is killed, and everybody's like, we got to do what that guy wanted. But it wasn't just the moon. The Civil Rights Act and LBJ's Great Society and a lot of programs to help the poor and downtrodden in this country, a lot of that comes from JFK's death. The Kennedys wanted to pass the Civil Rights Act. It was not politically feasible until after his death, and then with the national grief, outrage, and hope of how can I live up to the legacy of JFK, politicians were able to push and fight and get the Civil Rights Act passed. And then you also have the death of MLK. Very traumatic for the country, because that's the third, or was it the second? You have JFK, RFK. I think MLK died and then RFK. So you have 3 political assassinations in a decade. And after MLK's death, literally days later, you have the Fair Housing Act passed, and a lot of the progress of the civil rights movement and the continuation of the civil rights movement was because of MLK plus RFK's death just a few months later. But we see a different response after 9/11. American grief turned to vengeance against anything that was deemed remotely un-American, including being a Muslim. The hatred towards Muslim American turned into acts of violence against Muslim American communities, a lot of xenophobia towards these communities here in the US. And we also know that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were unjustified and led to the deaths of thousands of American servicemen, as well as hundreds of thousands of civilians, and instability in the Middle East for years, all due to the national outrage over 9/11. And the outrage over 9/11 coincided with the early 2000s surge in Christian nationalism that kind of all bubbled up after 9/11. You have the movement against marriage equality. You have the early victories of the anti-abortion movement coming to fruition. And you also have this rise in the zeitgeist of purity culture. When you think of purity rings on the Disney Channel, that was just a few years after 9/11, and it all comes from this cultural conservatism that really took over post 9/11 along with Christian nationalism. Today we can see this happening again after Charlie Kirk's death, only instead of a foreign enemy like World War II or a great national goal like reaching the moon or establishing civil rights after the death of JFK, we see a push for a blend of Christian nationalism, the merger of politics and religion into a unifying front against pluralism and an equal society. Right-wing leaders are now calling to ban left-leaning political movements. They're taking over Charlie Kirk's podcast to push anti-leftist messages of the state, literally. You have government leaders taking over a podcast. That should scare anyone. And we see many people conflating Charlie Kirk's death with Christian martyrdom with their religion. I have empathy for those who were connected to Charlie Kirk's beliefs. I understand that his death feels like an attack on your own beliefs, but we simply don't know the shooter's motivation at this time, and to push a message that because he died, your beliefs are under attack is simply not true, and it doesn't align with the actual reality of what is happening in our country politically and socially. The people Charlie Kirk worked closest with to get elected into power are in power. J.D. Vance was Charlie Kirk's choice for vice president. Donald Trump was his choice for president. The Supreme Court is packed with people that Charlie Kirk wanted to get into office. The professors who Charlie Kirk disliked the most and doxed, many of them have been fired and removed from their positions. Right now, today, people are being doxed and their jobs at risk for simply stating that they disagreed with Charlie Kirk. Culturally, we're at a time that Charlie Kirk worked for years. When sex and abortion is now really taboo in TV shows, you just have to look at the remake of And Just Like That to Sex and the City. In Sex and the City, the original show, abortion was something that the characters considered. It is something that was not taboo. And now, in the most recent remake, it's never brought up, even when a person who is at risk of dying because they're older, when they gets pregnant, abortion is never brought up in the conversation as an answer. And I think that's on purpose, because Hollywood knows even mentioning abortion as an option for a character would lead to such outrage and backlash that it's better to just pretend that women's reproductive health care is not on the table, that we don't have access to it, and just ignore it like it doesn't even exist. We know that Disney is taking out LGBTQ characters out of shows and movies. They're even canceling movies that have like LGBTQ storylines and that feature diversity. In states like Florida, public art is literally being paved over because it shows diversity in our state. In Texas, the state passed a law that the 10 Commandments must be on every single classroom wall. So no, Christianity and faith is not under attack by our government. Christians are not being persecuted. I have literally seen TikTok comments of people saying that Charlie Kirk's death is a sign that Christianity will soon be illegal. Christianity is at its most powerful that it has ever been in this country. I should say white evangelical nationalism coded with Christianity is at its most powerful. Christians are not being threatened by our current government. In fact, Christians in power right now are using Charlie Kirk's death to further strengthen and entrench their own position and authority. So in conclusion, I know this video has been kind of all over the place, but I hope you were able to follow through my chain of thought. How Charlie Kirk died is abominable. I hope, if anything, his death helps wake people up to the danger of online radicalization and how simply giving your kids a computer with access to the internet can lead to some of the darkest places online and can really and truly ruin lives. That is, I think, a message every parent should take from this. I can't change how Charlie Kirk lived, the words he spoke, or the people that he worked to get elected. Can't do anything about it. It's already happened. Whatever you believed about him, a video I make isn't going to change your views. And you have the right to believe and say whatever you want, and you should never feel threatened with violence because of your political beliefs. This video isn't really about that, though. This video is not really about Charlie Kirk's life. This video is specifically about how his death is going to be used as propaganda. And if that propaganda that is currently in the wheels of motion has shown in us anything, it is that the right-wing leadership in this nation have only one common interest, and that is further misinformation to enhance their own power. And they will use anyone's death to further their goals. I have some sources linked below, so thanks for watching. I know this is not a lighthearted video, it's kind of heavy, and maybe it's not as fleshed out as it should be because I just sat down and wrote what has been heavy on my mind the last few days, and I could be wrong, and I'd happily engage with anyone in the comments about that if you want to argue with me and try to change my mind, I suppose. This is the internet, it's an open forum. So you'll feel free to do that. If you disagree or you agree, feel free to leave a comment, as I said, or subscribe, and let me know what other topics you would like me to cover in the future. I have a whole video written about IVF and the propaganda about birth control and IVF and how it's being used to diminish women's reproductive choices. And I want to film that video, but this came up and I wasn't able to film that video last week because all I could do was watch the news last week. So I wrote that video literally Monday, and then the news happened. Was it Tuesday or when? I think it was Tuesday. And I've been kind of paralyzed with just like, wow, there's so much going wrong in the world. But I hope that I can say this little video, post it online, and then talk about other interesting things that I find. And I hope that you have a great day wherever you are, wherever you're watching, and wherever you are on the internet. I'll see you next time. Till then, see ya.
We're sorry. You have reached a number that has been disconnected or is no longer in service.